By 1919, Europe was buried under the physical and human wreckage of World War I. Entire towns and generations had been erased in 4 years of relentless trench warfare. When the victorious nations met to draft the Treaty of Versailles, they had the authority to construct a stable recovery. Instead, they drafted a blueprint for a future disaster. This map shows the exact penalty imposed on the losers. The treaty stripped Germany of its sovereign territory and its colonies. But more damaging was the financial penalty. The Allies demanded impossible economic reparations, designed specifically to humiliate and bankrupt the German state. The treaty's impossible economic demands ultimately crushed the very stability and peace that the document was originally intended to protect. Versailles formally began a 20-year countdown, fueled by deep-seated grievances and economic decay. For a brief window in the 1920s, the world managed to look away from the damage. Markets soared, and a sudden explosion of cultural energy masked the lingering instability of the war. New consumer technologies, like commercial radio, connected millions of people instantly. Families gathered in their living rooms, surrounded by modern conveniences, convincing themselves that this global prosperity would last indefinitely. But this diagram shows the reality behind that prosperity. Europe's economic recovery was an illusion, propped up by American debt. The United States loaned money to Germany. Germany used those loans to pay its war reparations to Britain and France. And Britain and France used that exact same money to pay back their own debts to the US. If any piece of this chain broke, the entire global financial structure would collapse, and all of it hinged completely on the unbroken success of the American stock market. The Roaring Twenties were a financial house of cards that kept everyone looking at the profits, while the structural foundation below them quietly rotted away. In October 1929, that foundation gave out. The U.S. stock market crashed, wiping out millions of investors and triggering immediate, widespread panic on Wall Street. Facing absolute ruin at home, American banks aggressively recalled their foreign loans. Watch what happens to the cycle. The flow of money violently reverses, draining capital out of Europe and instantly shattering their fragile recovery. The global economy froze. Within months, the roaring prosperity evaporated, replaced by mass unemployment, widespread poverty, and miles of citizens standing in urban breadlines just to eat. Democratic governments found themselves completely paralyzed. Legislators debated policy while millions starved. The sheer scale of the public panic quickly outpaced any institutional response. When a system can no longer provide basic survival, citizens stop believing in it. The extreme poverty and political gridlock created a massive power vacuum, perfectly suited for radical voices offering absolute solutions. Fascism operated like an opportunistic virus, feeding on this exact type of chaos. Benito Mussolini was the first to successfully exploit it, using armed gangs and nationalistic rhetoric to dismantle Italian democracy. Adolf Hitler gained ground by channeling the misery of the Depression and the bitterness of the Versailles terms into a single militant political force. These strong men offered a very clear psychological trade. They promised to restore jobs, enforce strict societal order, and return their nations to glory. In exchange, the public only had to surrender their civil liberties and practice total obedience. This collapse of democracy swept across the globe. In Japan, aggressive military factions seized control of the government, rapidly expanding their armed forces and adopting the same expansionist tactics. Dictators rarely seize power entirely by force. They are frequently welcomed by humiliated, starving populations who are willing to try absolutely anything to survive. By the late 1930s, the new authoritarian states began testing their boundaries. This map tracks Germany's rapid, illegal rearmament and expansion, first moving into the Rhineland, then annexing Austria, and pressing directly into the Sudetenland. The Western democracies watched this happen and chose a policy of appeasement. Economically exhausted from the Depression and still traumatized by the carnage of World War I, they refused to intervene. British leadership, guided by Neville Chamberlain, calculated that offering diplomatic concessions was the only way to avoid another conflict. They prioritized immediate, temporary quiet over confronting long-term totalitarian aggression. Democratic leaders literally handed over the sovereign territory of other nations to the dictators, operating on the vain hope that giving them what they wanted would finally satisfy their appetite. But ignoring aggression out of fear only proved to the dictators that their tactics worked. By refusing to enforce the peace, the democracies made a global war completely unavoidable. All those diplomatic concessions ultimately meant nothing. The newly industrialized, highly disciplined military machines built by the authoritarian states were fully primed and ready to be unleashed. In September 1939, German forces crossed the border into Poland, instantly drawing Britain and France into the conflict and officially shattering the 20-year truce. A piece of paper cannot sustain peace on its own. True peace requires economic stability and shared prosperity, because unchecked, starving desperation will always provide the perfect breeding ground for tyranny.